Do you ever say something just because it sounds true, but you don't actually know if it is true? You don't have any kind of specific research or digging. Maybe it merely sounds true. Maybe you're merely inferring that it's true. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to point the finger anywhere else. This is something that can happen on this show as well, this show being Fantasy for Real. But it's important to note that just because something sounds true doesn't always mean that it is true. Specifically for today's show, I'm talking about draft capital with the NFL draft a few days away from now. And the thing I want to get clear here is that sometimes we say things with draft capital that sound accurate and are mostly accurate when you look at how things generally line up, but they aren't necessarily accurate when you really break it down because of the fact that maybe something isn't quite what you think it is. The main reason I chose to start looking into draft capital is simply because a lot of people only talk about draft capital differences from day 1 to day 2 to day 3. While obviously the level of talent at each of these three levels generally is going to be so much different and obviously lead to the conclusion that day 1 is better than day 2 is better than day 3, it's important to note that not everybody on these days are created equal. And I guess the main idea or hypothesis I went into my draft capital research the very first time about a year ago was that ultimately it would be pretty unlikely if the actual points that the chances or likelihood of draft capital being important falling off was actually in the round breaks or even the day breaks, those specific points from picks 32 to 33 and say roughly 100 to 101. Could they be slightly more important? Maybe, but what are the chances that those are actually the arbitrary points that matter the most? To be clear, at best, draft capital is just one possible indicator. Now, it's one of the best individual indicators if you're only focusing on one thing, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect or fantastic. Outside of the running back position, it really isn't even something that you should base something on solely. It should be a big factor, but quarterbacks, wide receivers, and tight ends bust a very high percentage of the time, even at high draft capital. On today's episode of Fantasy for Real, the last full episode before the draft, I might come back Thursday with a quick mock draft show. I'm going to probably have the least amount of individual player discussion I've done on any episode so far on this show. If you're new to the show and the things that you care about the most are those rookie rankings, you can find those in the last 4 episodes, which are strongly focused on my positional rankings and big board this year, as well as the comparison to the last couple years. Today, though, I'm going to be talking about draft capital and what it has meant over the course of about the last decade. I'm going to go through each position individually, though the quarterback and tight end notes are going to be a little bit quicker because of the nature of those positions. The main focus is going to be talking about running back and wide receiver draft capital ranges. On top of that, one of the consistent questions I've gotten for this show is how to apply situation. Now, while most of this show today will be objective in looking at statistics of the last 10 or 11 years for draft capital, I don't know if there's a statistic or an objective measurement I can use to measure situation. Obviously, there are a few specific ones for a few specific situations, but not anything that's encompassing in any way. So for that reason, the situation discussion will be far more subjective. But to get back into and start towards the main portion of the show in regards to draft capital itself, there's not a lot of things to talk about that apply to every position. It really comes down to those opening words. I find a lot of the basic things people say are a little reductionist. Of course, day 1 is going to be better than day 2, but is that because the entirety of day 1 is better than day 2, or is that mainly because day 1 is going to get 100% of the elite players at any position? Getting ahead into what this research is going to show, generally speaking, what we're really looking for is that gap between elite players and non-elite players that makes the biggest first tier down. It's not day 1 to day 2 because late day 1 players are pretty much day 2 players. At least they're a lot closer than the elite players. Now, there is one specific thing to talk about for each and every position when it comes to day 1 draft capital, and something that I just kind of want to get out of the way to start the show, and that's the 5th year option. The 5th year option is a benefit for teams. That said, when it comes to the discourse surrounding the 5th year option or the way we talk about it, I think it gets a little overrated because just to begin, there's only been 2 quarterbacks in the last 10 years drafted between 27 and 32. Now, you can say both those quarterbacks, and Lamar Jackson and Teddy Bridgewater, were both taken pick 32, and that's very fair, but at the end of the day, 2 quarterbacks over a very long period of time is not enough to me to really bank on this as being important. Something that might happen and might entice a team, but only happens every 5 to 7 years, that's not something we're talking about all that much. And while I am only talking about the quarterback position, considering how much quarterbacks get paid, if we're valuing it this little at the quarterback position, it's probably not that valuable generally. Kind of getting back into the big dynamic between day 1 and day 2 is not necessarily the gap between elite and non-elite. A lot of the conversation around the draft revolves around the idea that most teams do not have enough true first round picks to fill out the first round. With this in mind, what you would imagine is that if a team had a actual first round graded player towards the end of the first round that they thought they could get at pick 32, it makes absolute sense to trade back up to 32 and secure the 5th round option. Most likely, the teams drafting between 27 and 32 are taking players that they're already admitting are very unlikely to be players that are the caliber that would even demand a contract the caliber of a 5th year option. So, not to say that this isn't always the most important thing, and it does sound a little bit like a cop-out, but when you're drafting 27 through 32 that late into the draft, the only thing you care about is getting a hit. You don't care about what will happen if this guy is a hit and we have a contract situation in the 5th year. That is the best possible situation to have. If that is the problem that you have, at minimum, you're probably getting 2 to 3 quality years of this rookie contract before you have this headache. So yeah, that's a good problem to have. So getting into the quarterback position specifically, I think these drop downs from elite to non-elite and say non-elite to a little bit, say, average-ish as a prospect, and I'll get into what some of these distinctions might mean in a second, I think these are the most important at quarterback. The reason I think they're the most important at quarterback is because they drop off the fastest. If you were asking me what the genuine highest caliber tier of draft capital for quarterback is, and like actually in its own tier, it is probably the number 1 overall pick. The drop off from number 1 to number 2 and beyond is even significant enough that that's probably your 1A. But more importantly at this position, the main thing that everyone talks about is just first round, and in my look over of the history, first round doesn't matter all that much. In fact, it's the first 12 picks that matter the most. Now, obviously, there's a lot of misses in the top 12 picks. Zach Wilson went 2 and Trey Lance went 3 in the same draft class. But outside of the top 12 picks in the first round, in the last 11 years, your quarterbacks are Mac Jones, Dwayne Haskins, may he rest in peace, E.J. Manuel, Kenny Pickett, Johnny Manziel, Jordan Love, Paxton Lynch, Lamar Jackson, and Teddy Bridgewater. So out of those 9 quarterbacks, your 3 hits are Lamar Jackson, Jordan Love, who's just become a hit, and Teddy Bridgewater. That's not a great ratio for not just the late first round, but the first round beginning at pick 13. The drop off between 12 and 15 is already fairly substantial in historical hit rate. So I guess when it comes to quarterback, when it comes to these things that we say but aren't necessarily true, we often talk about the first round as being an indicator of talent. But when we're looking at the historical lens of what first round actually means in talent, first round doesn't actually mean that much. If a team actually likes you, if a team actually has confidence in your ability, both your floor and your ceiling, they will take you in the top 12 picks. And those are the players that hit at a fairly reasonable level. So to me, if you're looking at the number 1 point where quarterback draft capital, at least historically, and at least what these things can tell us in the last 10 years, the biggest drop-off isn't day 1 to day 2. The biggest drop-off happens at about pick 12. So when you're looking at this draft class, I don't believe in making any of these things incredibly arbitrary lines. I'm not saying like, say, J.J. McCarthy falls to 13. I'm not making that a ginormous difference between that and 12. Though in this specific case, you could also argue that falling behind where the Vikings and Broncos are currently would be a different kind of indictment. But aside from that, the point is more so that if 4 of these quarterbacks go clearly in the top 12, which seems to be the projection right now, and 2 of these quarterbacks in Nix and Penix might even slip into the first round, but not until the late first round, that late first round draft capital grade, especially if it's in the mid 20s, the early 30s, that draft capital grade does not mean really anything to me when it comes to talent. Now, it does mean a little something to me when it comes to opportunity, and that's the next thing to get into when it comes to quarterback. If, at least by my opinion, we're already setting aside the fact that by pick 12, the talent grades are really not very predictive at all at quarterback, not any different between, say, the late first, too much than anything else when it comes to a huge bust opportunity. The main thing I'm actually focused on isn't the talent of these players next, but looking at them as opportunity situations. After pick 32, your next several quarterbacks drafted were Will Levis, Derek Carr, Geno Smith, Drew Lock, Christian Hackenberg, DeShone Kizer, Jalen Hurts, and Jimmy Garoppolo. So that gets you down to, say, an arbitrary line of about 62 in the last 10, 11 years. And if you were to bump it just to the end of the second round, just to make the number seem a little less arbitrary, the only name you'd have to add to that list is Kyle Trask. So Kyle Trask didn't get a lot of opportunity. Christian Hackenberg didn't get a lot of opportunity, obviously. But outside of that, all these guys got pretty significant opportunities. Even a quarterback like DeShone Kizer, who we mostly forget about, he did get a fairly long leash in a single year with the Cleveland Browns to show his capabilities. Now, I'm not saying that these opportunities are the same, that the first round opportunities are exactly just as good as these second round opportunities. But when you consider the players that actually hit, like Derek Carr, Jalen Hurts, to a lesser extent Jimmy Garoppolo, as well as the players who are getting significant opportunity or second opportunities like Will Levis and Geno Smith, you can look at this group as being just as good as the late first group, at least historically. And so I'm not trying to tie them together necessarily from a talent perspective. I think you could, based on the last 10 years. But you still do want late first round drafted quarterbacks over, say, mid second round drafted quarterbacks. Just logically, I think that's still going to be fair and true. But to me, the last 10, 11 years tell me is that players in the top 50 picks in particular, and even sliding into the late second round, are fairly likely to get that opportunity to at least prove themselves. So to me, one of the most overrated gaps in quarterback draft capital is, say, the difference between where a late first round quarterback goes and a Will Levis goes. Yes, Will Levis did go day 2, the second pick of day 2, the 33rd overall pick because of how the math worked that year. But early day 2 for opportunity is no different, and for talent is really no different at all. So to me, that's basically the same from a predictive standpoint as going in round 1. And frankly, just to make one final point of it, as much as Christian Hackenberg and Kyle Trask, if you're extending it to the full second round, didn't get opportunity, Paxton Lynch, who's drafted in the first round, has to be one of the top names for a quarterback who got very limited opportunity himself, and that's a first round quarterback. There were obviously many extenuating circumstances. They wrote a whole documentary about it. But Johnny Manziel is also on the bottom end of the opportunity spectrum. So these late first round quarterbacks have not even necessarily gotten greater opportunity than these second, third round quarterbacks. So I didn't do a hard, objective way to measure the actual opportunity, you say the games played, opportunities per player. But I can tell you that the general thing I'm looking for, the actual, a team giving you the opportunity and saying, hey, here's 5, 6, 7, 10 games at the very least. Here's your opportunity to be a starter next year, to win a couple games so that we can't replace you next year. Those opportunities happen just as regularly, at least historically, in the second round than they do in the late first round. So to me, the big 2 draft capital fall-offs for quarterback are pick 12 for talent, and then closer to picks 50 to the end of the second round for opportunity. Anybody drafted in that top 50 is going to get the opportunity. So for me, to put this into a practical context, I don't have the highest grade on Michael Penix Jr. or Bo Nix. I have them in the early second round, and if they're drafted in the mid-late first, in the mid-20s, in the early 30s, that will constitute a bump up in their grade. The fact that they have an opportunity to start at this position in Superflex is obviously going to give them at least some degree of floor value that is very valuable as soon as you get to the late first round. But they'll probably comparatively be lower on my rankings if they are late first round quarterbacks compared to other lists, because I think other lists will give the first round bump a bit more consideration, to where for me, the first round bump and the second round bump, if we're talking outside of those top 12 picks, isn't all that different. So that's going to be kind of something that might change a dynamic between my rankings and the consensus rankings around Michael Penix Jr. and Bo Nix. So quarterback will be a lot different than the other positions. That one was a lot more of a just kind of a general overview and kind of identifying a couple points. And part of that's because you don't have quite the sample with quarterback as you're going to get with running back and wide receiver. The next two positions I'm looking at from a much more statistical observation perspective. So let's get into what some of these studies have uncovered when it comes to these positions after a real short break. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me on the show today on Fantasy for Real. Just like everyone else, I am excited for the NFL Draft, and so I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone listening to the show what the immediate plans were for this podcast surrounding the NFL Draft. Saturday morning will see the first release of a post-draft big board, though it will only obviously be covering the first 2 days of the NFL Draft. I will update some thoughts on day 3 starting Monday morning, and then move into doing some deep dives throughout the NFL, including on the day 3 players selected, as well as conversations about fits and landing spots within the first 2 days. Aside from that, if there are any surprise day 2 picks that I haven't graded myself very highly or discussed on this show that end up going in the top 50, those are players that will need to be broken down the most. So there is a lot to look forward to, hopefully with this channel, and I hope you will keep an eye out for those shows. Now let's get back into this show covering draft capital and everything else surrounding this upcoming NFL Draft. To transition now into the running back position, I mentioned this up front, but running back really stands alone among these other 4 groups as being predictive by draft capital. Every other position has an elite group, and even the elite group is sometimes a little bit risky, but outside of the elite group in particular, every other position has a lot of problems and a very, very high rate of bust. For the running back position, that second tier group that maybe ends around, say, pick 75, pick 85, that group hits at a fair amount of time, and the early second round might as well be considered the elite group or the bottom end of the elite group at this point. Now, for my own historical observations, I like to use a very basic point system to try to break things down very easily. These things are all flawed. These things are all going to have different conversations about arbitrary lines and distinctions, and especially for wide receiver, we'll get into some of those. But importantly, what you really need to know is that for me, for this study, I'm giving a top 12 season 2 points and a top 24 season 1 point at the running back position. We'll get into this with wide receiver, but top 36 seasons get a half point with wide receivers. The difference being that wide receivers in, say, the 25 to 28 range are much more likely to be viable for a season. Because of the injuries around the position, the bottom few running backs who are already in the running back 2 range have questionable value on a year-to-year basis. You look at a player like J.D. McKissic, who will commonly show up at the running back 22, 23, 24 range in even half PPR leagues in healthy seasons, just because he's accumulated enough 6-7 point games and stayed healthy. It's also important to note, and we did see some drawbacks from this, at least to a lesser extent already with the quarterback study, but the main reason that all these mathematical things are so hard to do when it comes to the game of football is that information changes too quickly to get solid samples. In an ideal world, my sample would be based on players who have retired from the NFL, who have completed their entire journeys through the NFL. The problem is that if I selected only players who had retired from the NFL, my sample would be so old that it would pretty much not be representative anymore. The downside to doing it the way I've done it is that you have younger players who are going to naturally score lower overall because they haven't had the accumulation of accomplishments that the older players have had. While this is a relevant factor at every level of the running back and wide receiver conversations I'm going to have today, I believe that the separations and gap and also looking over the data can help to make sure that I'm not being blinded by this slight issue. And again, it's not that I'm choosing to have this slight issue. It's that in my opinion, there's no better way to do it because we cannot focus on just retired players. It's also important to note that there will be thresholds of draft capital used to display certain things in this study, and the thresholds were kind of chosen throughout the study or by doing the study. So, for example, keep in mind the idea that you might look at a draft capital range and the players in that range, and you ask yourself, well, if I move the threshold 5 picks this way, 5 picks that way, does it change the numbers to make them seem more or less significant? And I've played around with these thresholds manually myself for this study. I'm not going to get in specifically too much into which other distinctions were selected between or why these thresholds specifically, other than to just say that in my opinion, these are the most representative of the results of the last 10 or 11 years. The population for this study is top 100 drafted running backs, and within these top 100 drafted running backs, only 34.3% have never had a top 24 season. Now, having a 34.3 bust percentage might sound maybe a little high, but compared to every other position, that's going to be very, very low. And in fact, another 15% have had just one top 24 season. So when it comes to this group, 50% have had more than one top 24 season. 50% have at least 2 points on my scale. That's better than any other position is going to do at a draft capital range that reaches into the top 100. Outside of these bottom 50%, the next 25% of outcomes on the top 100 running backs as a whole scored between 2 and 4 points. So in mathematical terms, that's your third quartile, between say your 50th and 75th percentile, with the upper group being the 25% of running backs who have scored more than 4 points using the top 12, top 24 scale that I mentioned a minute ago. So especially considering what I mentioned earlier with the fact that one low top 24 season isn't necessarily even valuable at all, for this study, for the running backs, exclusively looking at the running backs themselves, what we're really going to be focused on today are those third and fourth quartile outcomes, the mildly high tier outcomes and the very high tier outcomes. So getting into tier 1 draft capital, the tier 1 draft capital threshold that I cut off was the top 25 picks in the last 11 years. Now, the top 25 picks does give us a very small sample size in the last 11 years. It is exactly 9 running backs and 11 if we extend it to Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs. And for the historical context I'm using today, I'm not including any rookies from the 2023 season. But within the 9 running backs, even setting aside Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs, who had excellent rookie years, these 9 running backs have been pretty flawless. None of the 9 running backs have fewer than 2 points, and most of the 9 running backs are already in the upper quartile of having more than 4 points over the course of their careers. Even from a rookie perspective, these guys are pretty much flawless within the top 25 picks. In fact, we can add Gibbs and Bijan into this study because they've had their rookie years. Out of the 11 running backs selected in the top 25, the only one to not have a top 24 season his first year was Travis Etienne. And that doesn't really count because Travis Etienne got hurt in training camp. So in general, the top 25 picks at running back, now to be clear, I don't think we're going to have any top 25 picks. In fact, I'm almost positive that we're not going to have any top 25 picks this upcoming draft at running back. But just for a general rule of thumb, these top 25 picks are the elite tier of draft capital that you want to focus on the most. Now, the second major tier that I've included here is the next 25 picks, the picks that take you from the late first round into the mid second round. And the biggest difference, before we even get into the numbers between this group and the next group, is going to be that while both groups have very, very high caliber hits, 26 through 50 still busts at a very, very small percentage of the time. Or at least I should say compared to every other position, right? The number within these 17 running backs is 41.2% have only a top 24 season or less. And that doesn't sound great, but compared to every other position, when we're mixing in the second round, even if we're not giving credit for top 24 seasons, we're not going to get to 41.2%. Those numbers are going to be in the 50s, the 60s% for the other positions. We're still hitting desirable outcomes at about 60% of the time, and the true highest tier outcomes are still coming up at least 30% of the time. these numbers are very, very manageable, shall we say, for a player drafted in the early mid-second round. Now, there's not quite as much difference between Tier 2 and Tier 3, and Tier 3 does have the fairly arbitrary numbers of being between picks 51 and 86, but there is a bigger population of here, and within that bigger population, there's a bust increase of about 12%. The third tier is the first time where having a top 24 season or less becomes more likely than having, say, a top 12 season or more, with those busts happening at about 53.6% of the time. So I don't want to belabor the point between Tier 2 and Tier 3 too much, but I guess what my main point would be is if you have strong grades between these players and you really want to lean on players going all the way up to pick 86, you can probably be fairly confident in the idea that the draft capital doesn't tell you it's very likely that the player will hit, and the draft capital also tells you that there's a decent chance that the player has high upside. But in general, they are different enough that I would definitely lean on players selected in those top 50 picks, especially if my grades are anywhere close. The more important fall-off point for the running back position is at pick 86. The final tier of picks here, since we're only going up to 100, is 86 to 100. Now, there aren't a ton of running backs in this group, and some of them did have fairly high expectations going into last year, and even going into this year, specifically in the case of Rachaad White. But even with Rachaad White in mind, this group has been fairly abysmal overall. Only 2 of the 13 running backs selected have been in the desirable range of having at least 2 points. The failure rate then, going from picks 51 to 86 to picks 87 to 100, jumps from 53% to 84% undesirables. Now, this is a small tier, but again, the main reason that I went into doing these draft capital studies was the idea that the big points that draft capital falls off are probably not the day ranges. I'm not saying that 86 through 100 is as bad as day 3 necessarily. I'm not saying that I wouldn't value the day 2 draft capital when a player goes in the late day 2. But at this running back position, if you're asking me where the big fall off actually happens, the biggest, most pragmatic fall off that we can point to and look at, that big practical pragmatic fall off that we should be the most focused on is not the gap between day 2 and day 3, but the gap that occurs around pick 85. I don't like to get super arbitrary when we're moving forward. When we're looking in hindsight, the number is 86, but I don't care about that. Moving forward, somewhere around the number 85, that's the point where after 85, most of those running backs have not shown any more likely of a chance to hit than any running back, say, on day 3. Now, to wrap up this position, it is also important to note that running back is a little different because it is a truly non-premium position. Tight end's kind of a non-premium position, but tight end's kind of this weird thing where if a team does convince themselves that a tight end is special, they can look at them just like a wide receiver. While running backs like Bijan and Jahmyr Gibbs do get called an offensive weapon to compensate for that fact a little bit, in general, running backs are still going to be considered running backs, and we're treating this position different year to year. So especially when it comes to this late day 2 draft capital, as running backs continue to get pushed back, maybe this number does continue to get pushed back, which I say this just because I don't want a player that, say I like a lot to get picked at 88 and then me rank them highly and people say, well, that's on the bad end of the threshold. And they'd be right on that. But the point is, this is all just kind of hard predictions to make. These are all estimations. We don't really know what's going to be the most important moving forward. What I can tell you is that from a past perspective, the biggest cutoffs are probably about from pick 25 and pick 86. Pick 25 is the point where anything after pick 25, you at least have a chance of busting. Now, not to say that busts don't happen before. My study doesn't go back far enough to get Trent Richardson, but he certainly exists. But it is important to note that from a general perspective, with some players busting in those late 20s, there really is a significant gap around pick 25, and in a similar light, there is a significant gap around pick 86. One final note, I was going back and forth between whether to use all of day 2 and pick 100 as a different thresholds. The reason I chose pick 100 is because I felt like that was the more consistent on a year-to-year basis, and that how many supplemental picks were in a year wasn't actually that important. That said, it is worth noting that right on the other side of a 100, both from a redraft and a dynasty perspective, you have a couple of hits, one on day 2 and one on day 3 in players like James Conner and Dameon Pierce. Even though Dameon Pierce only really had the 1 year, it's still 1 year that he did have. So while this late third round has been a bit of a graveyard, and it's still a graveyard if you throw those players in, as well as all the other players that you'd have to throw in, say between picks 101 and 105, it's still worth noting that there's a few positive outcomes that weren't in the study because of just how the cutoffs worked. And so that's all I really have for the running back position. I will be comparing some of these numbers to the running backs and wide receivers between each other, but it's important to note right off the bat as we transition into the wide receiver position that aside from just giving credit for top 36 seasons, the quartile ranges are different, right? So for example, in the running backs, the first and second, the bottom 50% included players that had a top 24 season. When talking about these 130 wide receivers moving forward that were drafted in the top 100 picks over the course of the last 11 years, that's not the case. The bottom 50%, and even slightly more than the bottom 50% of wide receivers drafted in the top 100 have never had a top 36 season at the NFL level. In fact, the exact number is 70 of the 130, or 53.8%, have never cracked the top 36. Instead of the cutoff from the third quartile to the fourth quartile being closer to 4 points, it's actually closer to 3 points at the wide receiver position. So I'm going to discuss at the end how running back and wide receiver compare to each other. In general, like I've said, running back is much higher, but it's important to note, even if you're using this study and looking at these numbers directly, that the running back thresholds are higher. So if the numbers look the same in terms of what percentage are in the higher desirable outcomes, just keep in mind that the level of desirable outcomes are slightly different here. The reason I did that is because I want these to relate more to the individual positions. I can talk about the crossovers between positions in kind of a summary fashion at the end of it. So the first range for me at wide receiver and the first big cutoff range at the wide receiver position is the top 12 picks. The top 12 picks are the ones that fairly limit the risk. Only 4 of the 17 wide receivers, or 23.5% of the wide receivers drafted in the top 12, have been total busts, and that includes players who failed because of injuries like Kevin White, or stupidity like Henry Ruggs. At least half of these, you could argue, were not bad talent grades. Now, I myself didn't love Ruggs as a prospect, but that's completely irrelevant. I will never ever claim that there was anything involved with my grade that led to Ruggs' failure ultimately. And so with that in mind, when you look at the way some of these players have failed in the top 12, you can really say, man, from a talent perspective, we really nail it, specifically in the top 12. 35.3% of the top 12 wide receivers have been at least semi-desirable, and 41.2% have been in the highest tier of outcomes. That's the highest ratio of getting into the higher tier outcomes of any group by far in this wide receiver study. Bringing this into the 2024 draft class practically, and I've talked about this on several occasions, to me, it is going to get to the point potentially if one of these wide receivers that's exciting, like Brian Thomas Jr., like A.D. Mitchell, goes to the Chiefs, goes to the Bills, but if those picks still happen and say 18, 20 or later, to me, the most underrated gap is going to be the difference between those top 3 and wide receiver 4. I'm not saying I won't be excited about that wide receiver 4, but going back to the very, very beginning, my whole thing for this piece is combating common phrases. Common phrases for wide receiver constantly say first round, first round, first round. And if Rome Odunze and Brian Thomas Jr. both go in the first round, people are going to say first round, first round, first round. But in my whole historical overview, there's a big difference between a guy who is projected to go firmly in that top 12, which Rome Odunze is, and a guy who's potentially going to go firmly outside of it 20 or later, like Brian Thomas Jr. and A.D. Mitchell. Now, if A.D. Mitchell or Brian Thomas Jr. get drafted in the top 10, maybe I'll recalibrate that opinion. But for right now, I think what's going to end up being the biggest tier gap, at least compared to the market for me, is going to be the difference between wide receiver 3 and wide receiver 4. I will gladly trade up to get that top 3 guy, even if the landing spot's not great, because to me, these are going to be the apex reasons for when you go talent versus situation, is when that guy is in the elite tier. That is when more than any time else in the world, you do want to target talent over situation purely. Now, the next two tiers of draft capital for wide receiver are probably the trickiest tiers to discuss. That is because, and I'll just do them together because it's easier, as soon as you get to, say, pick 13, wide receivers bust all the time. Now, the highest range outcomes hit a little bit better still than the day 2 picks. Your highest tier outcomes in the pick 13 to 32 range include CeeDee Lamb, Justin Jefferson, 2 of the top 3 wide receivers in football right now. They also include Brandon Ayuk. They also include DeAndre Hopkins and Brandon Cooks, some of the best wide receivers of the last several years. The problem is, outside of, say, about 7 wide receivers in the past 11 years, you start getting into players like Hollywood Brown, Kelvin Benjamin, Jerry Jeudy, where you're already getting into players where it's kind of like, this guy was pretty much all hype, and the only reason that the name even probably sounds as good as it was because of how many times you could have traded them on Keep Trade Cut. When you look at the actual production that players like Jeudy and Hollywood have put up the last few years, it's very unimpressive. Now, new situations for both players, maybe they prove new things this year. But the bottom line is, through 4 and 5 years of their careers, we haven't seen it yet. On top of that, call this historical randomness, call this whatever you want. The second best group of wide receiver draft capital in the last 11 years, pick 61 to 76. I chose that number of picks because it's about a half round, but if you were picking, but for any group of picks in the last 11 years, your first pick should be the first 16 picks, getting to pick any wide receivers from those first 16 picks. But the second best group, arbitrarily, is 61 to 76. 61 to 76 includes players like Tank Dell, DK Metcalf, Deontay Johnson, Terry McLaurin, DJ Chark, Juju Smith-Schuster, Cooper Kupp, Tyler Lockett, Allen Robinson, Jarvis Landry, and Keenan Allen. Maybe you say I threw in one too many names when it comes to a DJ Chark or a Juju Smith-Schuster, but for a half round of draft picks over 11 years, that, especially one that occurs primarily in the third round, that's a lot of hits. You've got maybe 9 to 12 genuine studs in this group. So the conversation here, I think, is the most nuanced. I think I could make the argument, because of how consistently they bust, starting at pick 13, that picks 13 to 76 really should be all one tier. Now, the main thing that keeps that from being true is the fact that the picks from 33 to 76, or whatever you want to distinguish from there, are hitting at the highest tier of outcomes a little bit less often. And the highest tier of outcomes are obviously the ones we want the most. Moreover, there's a logical argument here that I definitely don't want to ignore. The fact that the team who plays the 40th pick, or even pays for the 20th pick, is paying far, far more than the team who pays for a wide receiver with the 65th, the 70th pick. But for me, I guess my point is that if there's a player that I really, really like that is still in that early second round tier, that's not going to discourage me near as much as other positions. At other positions, these gaps getting away from the first round are going to scare me quite a bit more. They're a bit of a different argument. For running back, you're a little bit less scared because you actually think that the players still have a different chance to hit. At wide receiver, you might end up being a little less scared because of the fact that everything's random and you expect to miss everywhere. But the point is that players miss so often that you really shouldn't feel compelled to take first round players. It's interesting, going back a long ways, one of the most controversial draft capital dilemmas that I've basically ever seen in drafts is the fact that a lot of people really, really like Amon-Ra St. Brown going into the draft. Yes, before draft capital knocked him down to day 3, and a lot of people did not like Kadarius Toney. My point would be, in looking at that, is that there's a difference between saying you should be taking one over the other and just saying it's probably fine to just ignore Kadarius Toney if you want, at least to a large extent. If you want to fade a first-round drafted wide receiver until, say, all the wide receivers in the top 50 are gone, that's probably a justifiable decision if you're fading them for more significant reasons. So you do want to target the earlier drafted players. You do want to target the late firsts over the rest of day 2. But for me, historically, there's not a huge difference between the up to, say, pick 75 and the late first round. And more importantly, these players just simply bust so often that while we are focused on these first round picks because they have the highest tier outcomes in mind, the bust rate is so poor, I'm not afraid of, say, zigging where other people are zagging at wide receiver a little bit more compared to running back, where I think you should probably stay to draft capital itself. All that said, though, once again, my biggest point of emphasis for this entire show is going to be to focus on both false distinctions and also the most important points of distinction. So all that said, though, once again, my biggest point of emphasis for this show specifically is to make sure that the things we say a lot that sound true but aren't necessarily as true are not being given as much weight. Specifically in this case, that means that while yes, there is a gap, even in my own opinion, between the first round picks and the second round picks, the statement he went in the first round is valued at such a price in the market. And in my opinion, based on these numbers, it is overvalued. Maybe these numbers undervalue it a little bit, and maybe I'm swinging the pendulum a little too far. But I do think these numbers are clear that anybody who just says first round pick with a wide receiver as a big value boon is kind of missing the fact that after those top 12 picks, these guys bust all the time. And then carrying it on to the other main point, not just the false statements, but the statements that are a little bit more true. After pick 75, just kind of like at running back after pick 85, it's just as bad as day 3 mostly. I mean, not quite there, but it's pretty bad. Out of the 27 wide receivers drafted 77 or later, but still in the top 100 picks, 21 of the 27 never had a top 36 season. That's 78%. Only 4 are in the second tier group at 14.8%, and only 2 are in the top tier group at 7.4%. Nico Collins is a player in this sample that I like quite a bit, and I believe can extend that third group from 7.4% to like 11%. But that's still a very low number. And it's especially a very low number when you consider that the bust rate is creeping in on 80%. Even if a couple of these late drafted wide receivers still turn it around that were drafted 2022 or earlier, that's still going to be probably a very bad number compared to the rest of these groups. So while I'm not, say, encouraging the idea of taking day 3 picks over day 2 picks necessarily, one of the players, not to single them out, that got me to write this study or get into this in the first place was how often I saw people referring to Michael Wilson flatly as just day 2 draft capital. And it's like, okay, yes, he went in day 2, but he went in the 90s. Players who go in the 90s are barely going on day 2. And I think there's this kind of market reaction because people haven't done studies like this that just say, well, day 2 is day 2. So stop being so picky about it and just move on. But day 2 is not just day 2 because players after 76 bust all the time. So in my estimation, the 2 biggest takeaways here for wide receiver, for the market, which is the most important thing, is that the difference between the top 12 and the rest of the first round is underrated. The top 12 is safe. The rest of the first round is not. And then the second most underrated point is the fact that you don't need to get to pick 100 to day 3 for the bust rate to fly through the roof. You only have to get to about the 75th pick. Now, we've had a bunch of hits right on the other side of 75 at 76 exactly. That's why we can't use 75 as, the exact number. But I would say roughly around the 75 pick range, once you get far beyond that 75 pick range, even as soon as 80th pick, you're dealing with players who might as well be day 3 for the most part. Are they better than day 3? Are they a priority over day 3? Of course. But at the same time, 80% bust is a really, really high number, even for shooting rookie darts. So with those 2 main focal points in mind, that is all I have for the wide receivers. I will take a short break and then get into the final position, the tight ends. As always, I'd like to thank everyone for joining me on the show today on Fantasy for Real. Just like everyone else, I am excited for the NFL Draft, and so I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone listening to the show what the immediate plans were for this podcast surrounding the NFL Draft. Saturday morning will see the first release of a post-draft big board, though it will only obviously be covering the first 2 days of the NFL Draft. I will update some thoughts on day 3 starting Monday morning and then move into doing some deep dives throughout the NFL, including on the day 3 players selected, as well as conversations about fits and landing spots within the first 2 days. Aside from that, if there are any surprise day 2 picks that I haven't graded myself very highly or discussed on this show that end up going in the top 50, those are players that will need to be broken down the most. So there is a lot to look forward to, hopefully with this channel, and I hope you will keep an eye out for those shows. So I've mentioned this before, tight end is going to be a little bit more like quarterback, whereas running back and wide receiver, there was a lot more of a direct statistical study. This is more of just kind of a general overlook, and that's to begin because there's not that much sample of highly drafted players. I think if you were just trying to ballpark it with what we've seen historically, even going back to the year 2000 at the tight end position, you would want to focus on the top 10 players drafted at the position. The problem is, even if you focus solely on players drafted in the top 10, you're only going to end up with a sample of about 5 going all the way back to 2000, which is about twice as long as the rest of this study. When you only have 5 and you have an Eric Ebron, not to single out an individual, that's going to destroy the hit rate at the position. The outcome of someone like Kyle Pitts is absolutely paramount to what this position is going to look like, because right now the top 10 is Hockenson and Ebron. If Kyle Pitts ends up being one of the best tight ends in football, and you have Pitts, Hockenson, and then on the other side, Ebron, that's probably a worthwhile risk for a top 10 drafted tight end, even if that's a small sample to base it on. But if Pitts is continuing to go down the path he's at right now and doesn't peak at, say, more than he's been for fantasy so far, in that case, the top 10 is very overrated and doesn't really say much at all when you look at the median or average outcome for those top 10 players. By expanding into the first round, you gain players like Tyler Eifert, OJ Howard, Evan Ingram, David Njoku, Hayden Hurst, Noah Fant, and Dalton Kincaid. That's not a terrible group overall, but you do have complete busts even aside from things like injuries, which Tyler Eifert had, and OJ Howard. You have players who have just made their first relevant year in season 7, like David Njoku, and you have players who have never quite made the most of their potential, like Noah Fant. When you extend it to the second round, you have a lot of names that you'll be familiar with, but a lot of names also like your Brenton Stranges, your Adam Shaheens, your Max Williams, that just never really did too much. I will say that at the end of the second round seems to be the point where teams really start to take more dart throws at third round tight ends. So any tight end drafted in those first 2 rounds, those would be the tight ends that intrigue me later in my drafts, aside from the elite profiles like Brock Bowers and Kyle Pitts. But in general, I guess my point here is just that I didn't want to skip over the position. I didn't want to just say, tight end's a crapshoot, let's move on. I wanted to actually explain that tight end's a crapshoot. But I don't even have any numbers to really draw from. If you're asking me to combine small sample math with logic, I would say that there is something to be said about, say, the top 10 picks or being close to the top 10 picks historically. But that's not really a great mathematical argument, and it's one, again, based on a very small sample. So taking this to Brock Bowers and even to a lesser extent JT Sanders and Ben Sinnott, the main thing that's going to get Brock Bowers into the early first round, the mid-early first round at least, is going to be my personal grade on him. As long as he doesn't slip very far, it's that personal grade that's going to drive Brock Bowers. Top 10 would be encouraging, but, it's not necessary. The most important thing for me about tight end is still going to be the fact that Eric Ebron and Kyle Pitts being controversial still at this point, are 2/3 of the top 10 drafted players in the last 11 years. That's kind of the problem in and of itself. Players like JT Sanders, Ben Sinnott, I would be encouraged if they went in the second round, because the combination of the profiles and the names that we have heard crop up in that second round, that would encourage me a good bit. But more importantly than anything else, while I did cover this position, it is only really important to know that tight end is a crapshoot. And so that is all I have for Draft Capital today. I do want to discuss situational things just briefly, though I will say once again, whereas the rest of this, podcast was about looking at history and studying it and studying it objectively, there's nothing I can really say about situation that isn't subjective. At the quarterback position, I have to say this to check myself for my own biases as a Bears fan, but I do not believe that the long history of an organization is really relevant at all. I believe that the short history of an organization is much more important. For example, now Bill Belichick's not there anymore, and he is one of the greatest coaches ever, but the way he was managing the offense towards the end was very concerning to me. And if we're comparing that Patriots to basically any other team, even a team with the historical lack of success of the Chicago Bears, I'd rather have the Bears as a landing spot than the one that used to have Tom Brady, because just the way that they were doing things in New England with, Matt Patricia being a major offensive coaching staff member. So for quarterback, more than anything, you're looking, at least in my opinion, for concepts that align with stability. Wide receivers, weapons, and personnel can be very important for stability, but really it's going to come down to being put with a coach that they can work with for a long period of time. For all of the benefits that both kinds of coaches have, specifically for the real NFL, that's why for fantasy football, you would rather a quarterback go to a place that has a offensive head coach, just because you know that that offensive coach isn't going to go anywhere. For example, going back to it as a Bears fan, if Shane Waldron is the best offensive coach in football, not that that's very likely, I'm just giving what ifs, he's very likely to take another job next year, potentially as a head coach. A coach like Kevin O'Connell with the Minnesota Vikings, who's already the head coach, if he develops a rookie quarterback in year one, the most ideal thing that can happen for the Minnesota Vikings, no one's going to be poaching him. He's not going to leave the Vikings for a different head coaching opportunity. This isn't college football and there's no Alabama out there. He's going to stay at Minnesota and be the head coach there unless there's a Jim Harbaugh San Francisco issue. And also kind of keeping in mind Jim Harbaugh and the way we've been talking about Justin Herbert and the Chargers, I think it's also important to note that stability doesn't always necessarily align with upside situations. Now, to be very, very clear, the Chargers are not going to move Justin Herbert. But if they did, the Jim Harbaugh situation that I've been not liking for Justin Herbert because of a projection on his volume, I would actually really enjoy that for a young quarterback, because it would make me feel more comfortable that the stability and the what he's being asked to do are going to make him more likely to develop into a solid player over time. So while it is a hard thing and a very ineffable thing to kind of quantify, if I am valuing something in quarterback situation, it's going to be the coaching staff and the stability generally. And specifically, if the offensive coaching staff is going to be able to stay with the player for a long period of time. I also probably should have covered this up front, but before I get into running backs and wide receivers, I want to make sure I mention that situations are things that I don't love talking about generally, because I think that situation becomes the ultimate get out of jail free card for what I do as an analyst. Don't get me wrong, there's a difference between saying that and believing that it's never situation. I'm not saying that it's never situation, but what I am saying is that anytime that a player you like goes to even a questionable situation, you've now given yourself, if you're someone who talks about situation a lot, a get out of jail free card to say, well, I didn't get it wrong, they just went to a bad place. I don't really like what that does for analysis when it comes to an overview of situation. I think that's why I don't focus on situation quite as much and try to lean on the idea that the best players are going to push themselves in whatever situation and become that. But I guess the importance of putting that here is that running back, just like quarterback, is a position where you don't get to earn targets like you do at wide receiver. At running back, you can be, in your opinion, the best player on the team and never get to showcase that in any capacity because you're not getting snaps or carries. This is probably why, just going back to the most important and main part here, that draft capital is so important to the running back position, because what does draft capital say? Draft capital is a coach saying, I believe in you. Why is there some kind of relevance, in my opinion, to the idea that if Blake Corum goes to the Chargers, it is actually a relevant landing spot? Because Jim Harbaugh already believes in him. That is relevant. It is relevant to have a standing rapport in a position where the rapport between coach and player is so important. At wide receiver, the rapport between quarterback and wide receiver is so important. But for running back, it's the rapport between the coach. So if you're looking for things situationally, you're looking for that coaching staff's tendencies. Why is the Pittsburgh Steelers still the best landing spot for running backs, theoretically? If say, like next year, they just, for just a random argument, got rid of Najee and Jaylen Warren and had nobody, why would that be such an ideal landing spot? Because of the way that Mike Tomlin still uses his running backs. Even with Jaylen Warren splitting a little bit more than most players have in the past with Najee Harris, Mike Tomlin has still showcased himself as a coach who's more willing than others to give a running back the full load. There's also important things to look at in terms of both volume of rushing as well as scheme of rushing, to the perspective of
a guy like Jim Harbaugh, who runs a lot and runs that Greg Roman offense that's going to run a lot, that can create a lot of carry opportunities for these running backs. A coaching staff like the Mike McDaniel coaching staff in Miami is going to be more likely to generate explosive plays, which is going to have a chance to make the most out of a running back with explosive ability. That kind of leads me into scheme for running back, but I think scheme is something specifically pre-draft that you're probably going to spend more time wasting thinking about than actually has a practical benefit. And the main reason is because running backs are pretty likely to end up with scheme fits. I could talk about how I wouldn't feel very good about a player like Isaac Guerendo specifically in certain scheme fits because I don't think he navigates the line of scrimmage well, despite his size. But that's probably not going to matter because I'm guessing that the team who picks him is going to either see him as a special teamer or see him as someone who's going to run a lot of outside zone. So there are scheme things that are relevant at the running back position, but frankly, I think they're more relevant if you were just trying to predict what running back we're going to which teams. I think most of those things are going to be taken care of by the NFL draft when it comes to scheme. But roles and how coaches like to use roles, those aren't going to be taken care of by the NFL draft. And those are things that you're going to want to be at least a little bit familiar with coach's back history. And if it seems like a lot to be familiar with each coach's back history, just worry about the ones that actually draft fairly highly drafted running backs. At wide receiver, I think the most beneficial situation any wide receiver can get into, not a rookie, but anybody, is being a tier of talent above everybody else. As much as that might make you a focal point, if you're in a good passing environment and you are talented enough to actually be a tier above everybody else and not just be someone who's the best on a bad team, who no one's going to give any credit for on a different team or who wouldn't earn targets on a different team, if you're a player who's actually a tier better than everybody else, that's a great position to be in because you're going to have both floor and ceiling opportunities. A good anecdotal example of this is how DJ Moore last year, despite being in a bad overall pass catching environment, was so far and away the focal point pass catcher that, yes, it was in a couple of explosive plays more than anything else, or explosive games rather than anything else, but DJ Moore was a phenomenal wide receiver on a seasonal level in 2023. I've talked about this in a few different capacities on the show as well, but it's always funny to me the way we talk about quarterbacks generating volume as if that's a one-to-one comparison to their personal value or their ability as a coach or as a quarterback. Quarterbacks who run, have rushing touchdowns, and throw the ball the least in terms of completions are creating smaller pie for their wide receivers. In my opinion, the two worst landing spots that can possibly occur in this NFL draft are the Ravens and the Colts. Because not only are the Ravens and the Colts these environments that have pass-first quarterbacks, but they also have Michael Pittman and Zay Flowers on the two teams already representing a fairly high percentage of the market share. So having a market share player there already, bringing in a second market share player will not make me feel good at all about that player being brought in. And in fact, if there is, like, say, a first round draft capital that could tank a player, I'm not saying it's likely. I actually think it's very unlikely. But if the Colts or Ravens spent first round draft capital on a wide receiver, that player is probably going to be pretty tanked for me compared to a standard first round pick. The most difficult thing about wide receivers is crowded rooms. And I think you do have to consider crowded rooms relevant because there is something to be said about the fact that assets that gain value over that first season are ultimately the ones you want to get because they give you pivot points. If there's one situational thing I've said over the last 4 or so draft classes that has ended up being very, very, very accurate, it is in my comparisons between Amon-Ra St. Brown and Nico Collins. As rookies, while I did generally lean to Amon-Ra because of my pre-draft grades, my main reason for wanting Amon-Ra over Nico Collins was you could paint this picture of a well-polished, maybe not elite physically talented wide receiver who had played inside roles, going to a quarterback in Jared Goff, who had most recently used Cooper Kupp as his main wide receiver, mostly focusing on those inside roles. And comparing that to a player like Nico Collins, who never was really productive in college and was going to a situation in Houston where he wasn't going to really be set up to do some of the easy things, right? Like contrast that to Rashee Rice. A lot of people who didn't love Rashee Rice going into the process last year didn't love Rashee Rice because he didn't do some specific things really well. And what did Rashee Rice end up doing to be productive? Things that weren't all that specific, taking out some underneath things and just having some yak yardage on top of it. That's not to say it will always break down this way, but there are certainly teams both in terms of the intellectual brain trust at the top with an Andy Reid potentially, as well as teams who need a player to step up and have a quarterback who can provide a stable market. Those are going to be teams that are obviously ideal situations. That's why so many people are excited about the Bills and even to a lesser extent, the Jaguars. Because while Trevor Lawrence might not be a fantastic quarterback, he doesn't run so much that the volume is still going to be pretty decent and the volume opportunity is going to be pretty high, even for someone who likes Christian Kirk, when the number 2 wide receiver is either Gabe Davis or Zay Jones. And obviously, Evan Ingram is there as well. The most concrete thing to say about wide receiver is just the relationship between a slot or a player needing to play in the slot. Obviously, there's a lot of outside versatility in the NFL game now, and a lot of players who used to be thought of as inside only are playing outside roles, or at least partial outside roles. So I don't want to say that, I don't want to make it like it's so limited of a box. But in general, if you have a player who you see as needing to have the slot more often to win, I could easily see that player being a worse fit in certain situations. As someone who loved Jaxon Smith-Njigba going back a year, one of the things I like to say about why Garrett Wilson might get a higher NFL draft grade than Jaxon Smith-Njigba is that while I could see them both being equally important parts to an NFL offense, I would rather have 2 Garrett Wilsons than 2 Jaxon Smith-Njigbas, because I wouldn't want to play one Jaxon Smith-Njigba outside all the time. Whereas I would be fine playing one Garrett Wilson outside all the time. That's kind of the dynamic there. A bit more of an extreme example than Jaxon Smith-Njigba, but as someone who likes Malik Washington specifically in this class, I would not want Malik Washington to go to a team that already has a primary slot receiver. While this is not ideal for Malik Washington, because it does seem like there's more teams that have smaller wide receivers and need a big wide receiver than teams who have a bunch of big wide receivers and need smaller, fast guys, you would want Malik Washington to go to a team that has some more outside players and maybe some less talent on the slot inside roles. So all that considered, wide receiver is probably the trickiest situational position to talk about just because there's so many different things going on at the position. But at the end of the day, it's really just these specific things in terms of slot usage, the quarterback situation, the wide receiver talent situation. Not reinventing the wheel here. This is probably things that are pretty standard to go with it, but just things to keep in mind. And then there's really nothing to say about tight end because there's so many things that are already focused on it being a crapshoot. But I guess what I would say is the same things I would say about wide receiver. You want a path to a big receiving role. Now, to be clear, a big receiving role, specifically a tight end, does not specifically mean a number 1. But if you look at like the Sam Laporta case, Sam Laporta came into a situation where outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, the only real competition for a redraft perspective was going to be on the bench for the first 6 games. So Sam Laporta came into an opportunity where the volume situation was excellent last year. And so that's what you really want. You want a tight end who has a path to being at minimum that number 2 option. That's what you're looking for the most at the tight end position. That is all I have for situation. That is all I have for this show for the most part. I will take a quick break though before getting in to some end notes. Saturday morning will see the first release of a post-draft big board, though it will only obviously be covering the first 2 days of the NFL draft. I will update some thoughts on day 3 starting Monday morning, and then move into doing some deep dives throughout the NFL, including on the day 3 players selected, as well as conversations about fits and landing spots within the first 2 days. Aside from that, if there are any surprise day 2 picks that I haven't graded myself very highly or discussed on this show that end up going in the top 50, those are players that will need to be broken down the most. So there is a lot to look forward to, hopefully with this channel, and I hope you will keep an eye out for those shows. So now let's get back into this show and get into some final ending notes. So just a few quick notes and clarifications before I finish up this show.
In terms of the top 12, it's interesting. I probably should have mentioned Jameson Williams alongside Henry Ruggs and Kevin White. Jameson Williams is obviously his own conversation for a number of reasons, including the fact that, unlike Henry Ruggs and Kevin White, we think that there's at least a reasonable chance that he still puts up some decent seasons. But at the end of the day, Jameson Williams is a top 12 pick, has not had a top 36 season, but also kind of does fit into the Kevin White, Henry Ruggs category at least a little bit in terms of off-field things, because he missed his first season with injury and missed a significant portion of his second season with a gambling suspension. When you really boil it all together, the busts in the top 12 really have come, in general, from two groups. Extreme body outliers like Tavon Austin and John Ross, and these off-field concerns. That is kind of why, once again, these top three having grades that I myself align with the top 12 pick, and it seems very likely that the NFL will align with the top 12 picks, is what makes Harrison Jr., Neighbors, and Odunze so exciting. Maybe an off-field issue does happen for one of them, but that's not something we can really project at this point. Aside from that, at the wide receiver position, again, I think the most important thing to hammer home, just kind of because a discussion broke out around the same time that I was writing this show on some social media that I followed about this debate between the late first and the second and early third round. It's important to note that just in general, even where you set your parameters for these things matters a whole lot. If you say if you change my study to go back to 2011, you'd include 3 wide receivers in the first round who aren't very good. However, if you moved it back another year to 2010, you would include a 2 wide receiver sample in the late first round of the late Demaryius Thomas and Dez Bryant. Not really saying anything here that I haven't said before, either in terms of the parameters or in terms of these high upside, high bust opportunities. The point just being that the main numbers that I was seeing, I guess, that really went against what I've been saying here were focused on the highest ceiling outcomes. So, for example, some significant hits that exist in that second to third round range that really don't exist as much in the first round range are players like T. Higgins, Michael Pittman, Terry McLaurin, even Tyler Lockett didn't hit some of the specific thresholds that some of these lists were looking for. Because there is an element of longevity in my own rankings, players like Lockett in particular score extremely well in the way that I do this study. If you're only looking for the highest caliber points per game outcomes, Tyler Lockett might not have even had one of those throughout his entire career, but he's been a very good receiver very consistently. So I guess my point in saying that is I think that's kind of the gap between the late first round and the middle day 2 to early day 2 range. In general, are the busts a little less likely in the first round? Yes, but I'm not sure it's all that different in terms of the actual true zeros. The biggest difference is that a lot more of the hits in the day 2 range are ending up being like Michael Pittman's and Terry McLaurin's, to whereas a decent number of the hits in the round 1 range are ending up being Ayuk's and Cook's and Hopkins and Lamb and Justin Jefferson and these really, really high-end guys. So again, my point with all this at wide receiver, I would lean, because of expected value, towards those first-round picks, but they bust so often, I don't mind going for the day 2s instead, because ultimately what I really don't want in the mid-late first round is a 0. I didn't really intend this as a tangent within the end notes, but I guess this probably goes into a little bit of your philosophy as a manager as well. While the highest outcome players are championship winners, and those are players that are very important to get to your team, my philosophy as a manager is to constantly avoid zeroing outcomes. So in this perspective, I could see how maybe my philosophy values hitting on a T. Higgins, hitting on a Pittman, hitting on a Terry McLaurin a little bit higher than a lot of other people, because at the end of the day, I'm fine with that even if it doesn't become an elite player, because if I'm avoiding zeros, I have a lot of value on my roster. If I'm constantly avoiding zeros in several avenues of playing fantasy football, I'm going to have a lot of value on my roster, and I can be the guy who can put these values together and go up and get a gold tier player. I did talk about the relationship a little bit between the wide receiver and the running back positions, but I never really put numbers to it. And because the quartile ranges, or what designated hits, was a little bit different from position to position, I wanted to make sure I was clear on the differences here. The biggest gap between the two positions is, again, going to be in avoiding those zero tier outcomes. I said this at one point in the show, but 70 of 130 wide receivers, or 53.8%, never had a top 36 season. If you include only one top 36 season, you get to 59.2%. So 59.2% have never had a top 24 season. When it comes to running backs, and keep in mind I don't give running backs any points for a top 36 season, which is the still difference between these numbers here, only 34.3% of running backs have failed to have a top 24 season. So about a third of running backs have failed to have a top 24 season. About 60% of wide receivers have failed to have a top 24 season. About 65.3% have had only 1 point on my scale, 70% have had only 1.5, and 73.8% of wide receivers have had only 2 points. So 73.8% have some combination of 1 top 12 season, 2 top 24 seasons, or say a top 24 and 2 top 36 seasons. In comparison, 58.2% of running backs have had at least a top 12 or 2 top 24 seasons. So, are the numbers do get a little bit closer as you get higher up into the values. And that is ultimately why, at the end of the day, you're always picking the higher tier player relative to the position over the position itself. But again, getting into the practical takeaways, I think when it comes to these two positions, when you get past the elite tier, the running backs having the higher floor and avoiding the zero outcomes is pretty enticing in terms of having a safe asset. The other thing I didn't really talk about with the running backs is just the fact that you're never going to get the value respect for running back that you're going to get at other positions. Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs have a lot of respect in the market right now, but if they, as a rookie, had a top 12 wide receiver season or a top 12 quarterback season, as we've seen with CJ Stroud and Puka Nacua, and Puka Nacua is even kind of an asterisk because some people still don't believe in Puka Nacua because of the day 3 thing, or at least the evaluation that led to the day 3 thing. It is fair to say that running backs have a relatively lower respect in the marketplace for the results and the value that you're putting out. But if you're trying to win championships, you also need that production at the running back position. When it comes to the late first round draft picks, I prefer to draft the running backs because I feel like I get hits with a reasonable chance of being really great players, as opposed to with the wide receivers, I do have a chance of getting the high outcome guys, but I also have a greater chance of just having a nobody on my roster that I'm regretting I didn't sell off at a different point. A lot of people recently have been saying that the late first round picks have been kind of the worst places to buy a running back, but I think that's a skewed perspective because those are overdrafted running backs taken at the very end of day 2 and even early day 3. That's a very different thing to me. Here I'm probably talking about the top 50 to say 75 picks with a little bit of wiggle room beyond 75 because running back is such a low value position. A lot of the guys that have busted, like Keyshawn Vaughn, Trey Sermon, these have been the guys that have been drafted at the very, very tail end of round 3 and have only been called day 2 on basically technicalities. Again, I don't mean to say it like that. Like it's not really a technicality, but as this whole show has been about, the drop-off point isn't day 3, it's a little bit before that. Not to say that it's going to be perfect moving forward, but if you apply a drop-off point that's closer to, say, 86 than day 3, and then you take off all those running backs that were drafted after 86 from the late first round, from the early second round, all of a sudden you get rid of all the busts pretty much. With that in mind, the running backs that are left are very enticing and intriguing. And in a lot of classes, those running backs are getting drafted a little bit higher. But in this class, the running backs, at least the potential running backs that are going to go in the top, back into the second round, those guys could be very late first round picks. So I have said this before, but from a value perspective, the top couple running backs off the board, provided that they get decent draft capital and a decent landing spot, are going to be some of my favorite values in rookie drafts this offseason. Now, with that said, that is all I have for this show today. I am still thinking about doing a show on draft day that will go over some likelihoods, some mock drafts, but I'll want some of the final mock drafts from some of the more predictive mock drafters to be out before I do that. As long as those mock drafts get posted in time, I will probably cut up a very short show and release it on Thursday. I'm not sure if very many people will get around to it. It is draft day after all, but the main reason I want to release this short show is just to get all of my
early draft predictions on record and just see how they do. The most important thing, the main thing you should look out for, as I've said a couple times on this show, at least in the breaks, is the post day 2 show that should be out Saturday morning. I am planning on pretty much as soon as day 2 ends on Friday to start working on a full reaction show that lists an initial big board. Will the big board change based on day 3? Yes, depending on how deep it goes, but not that much. Occasionally you will have a player that falls onto day 3 that you really like and ends up going to a really good situation. The two potential players for me in this class are probably going to be Malik Washington and Ray Davis, considering how they're considered in the market. Those are players I at least think have a chance of falling to day 3 and still liking a decent bit. But for most years, the highest day 3 players on my rankings end up coming in at like, say, the late second round, mid third round at the very earliest. So those aren't going to be the most important value shifts when it comes to doing an early big board. So with all that said, look out for that show Saturday morning. I will see you then or potentially before the draft with a preview show. But whenever I see you next, take care, and it's time to get ready for the NFL draft.